Elena sat in the small, cluttered waiting room of the adoption agency, trying to steady her nerves. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced a smile. After months of paperwork, interviews, and preparation, she was finally here, about to meet the child who might change her life. Her mind still lingered on the divorce that had shattered her marriage a year ago. She'd spent that time trying to rebuild her life, working late hours, meeting with friends, even trying therapy, but nothing seemed to fill the emptiness. She wanted to be a mother, more than anything. That's when she decided to look into adoption. And here she was. The door to the office opened, and the agency worker called her name, pulling her from her thoughts. Elena stood quickly, adjusting her blouse before walking into the room. Seated across from her was a small boy, around 10 years old. His dark hair was unkempt, and his eyes, though not unfriendly, held an unmistakable sadness. He had the look of a child who had been through a lot, and Elena's heart clenched. She'd been warned that Max had been in the foster system for years, but she hadn't expected to see this level of quiet sorrow. "Hello, Max," Elena said, kneeling beside him to offer a gentle smile. Max didn't smile back, but he did look at her. His eyes studied her face as if trying to make a judgment. "I'm Elena. I'm here to take you home," she said, her voice warm and inviting. Max didn't respond, his gaze flitting away as he turned his attention to the ground. There was an awkward silence as the agency worker looked on, but Elena didn't mind. She knew it would take time for Max to open up. He wasn't like the other children she had met, those who had hoped to be adopted into a new home, eager for affection and love. Max wasn't like that. He was withdrawn, distant, but she could see the pain in his eyes. She couldn't help but feel drawn to him. The drive to her new home was a quiet one. Elena kept stealing glances at Max, who sat in the passenger seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He stared out the window, his face expressionless. The house she had chosen for them was small but charming, an older home on the outskirts of town, with a white picket fence and a front porch that seemed to invite someone to sit and relax. It was the perfect place for a fresh start, a place where Max could begin to feel safe. When they arrived, Elena made sure to show Max around the house, letting him pick out his room first. He chose the smallest bedroom at the end of the hall, almost as if he preferred the isolation. Elena didn't press him. She let him be. After all, she knew it would take time. But as she went about unpacking, something felt off. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something about the house that gave her a strange feeling, like it was holding a secret. That night, after dinner, Elena tucked Max into bed and decided to relax with a book on the couch. But as she was reading, she heard a faint sound, scratching, like something was scraping against the wall above her. She looked up, confused. It was too deliberate to be a rodent, and too soft to be the wind. Elena felt a shiver run down her spine. The noise continued, growing louder, almost like someone was trying to get her attention. Trying to ignore it, Elena put down her book and went upstairs to check on Max. She opened his door quietly, relieved to see him sound asleep in his bed. As she closed the door, she thought she heard the scratching again, but when she looked down the hall, it was still. She dismissed it as the house settling. After all, it was old, but the scratching didn't stop, and neither did her growing sense of unease. The night after Elena had tucked Max into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had checked on him, reassured herself that the boy was settled, yet the house felt different. The sounds from the attic had unsettled her. At first, she thought it was just an old house settling, the creaks of the floorboards or the pipes. But when the scratching continued, growing louder in the quiet of the night. She started to question whether there was something more to it. Unable to ignore the sensation of being watched, Elena decided to investigate. She sat in the living room with a cup of tea, pretending to read her book, but every so often, her eyes would dart toward the stairs. It was foolish, she told herself. A new house, new sounds, but her instincts were telling her something else. Something dark was lurking just beyond the walls. Around midnight, she couldn't take it anymore. The scratching from the attic grew even more pronounced, sharp, frantic, as if something or someone was desperately trying to escape. Elena stood up quickly, dropping her book onto the couch and walking toward the stairs. She grabbed a flashlight from the drawer in the hallway and slowly ascended the creaking steps. The house was quiet now, the only sound her own breathing as she moved toward the attic door at the end of the hall. The scratching had stopped, but the air around her felt thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She reached for the door handle, hesitating for a moment, but then pushed it open with a quiet groan. The flashlight beam sliced through the dark, illuminating the narrow staircase leading up to the attic. Her heart raced as she climbed the steps. The attic door creaked behind her as it swung shut, leaving her feeling even more isolated. Elena knew she wasn't the first to investigate this house. She had read the records, nothing out of the ordinary, just an old home with a long history of different families coming and going. But as she stepped onto the attic floor, the unsettling feeling she had been carrying with her since arriving intensified. The attic was dusty and cluttered with old furniture and forgotten knickknacks, perfectly ordinary. Nothing seemed out of place, but Elena's gut told her something was wrong. She moved carefully through the room, shining the flashlight across the corners, checking the rafters and peering under the tarps and boxes. There was nothing. No sign of anything out of the ordinary. The room felt empty, but somehow not empty. She felt a presence, an almost tangible weight in the air, like the walls were pressing in on her. She couldn't explain it, but the sensation was so strong that she quickly turned on her heel and rushed back down to the safety of the second floor. As she passed Max's room, she paused and pressed her ear to the door. She was about to open it to check on him again when she froze. There it was. The faint scratching sound had returned, and it was coming from his room. Panic surged through Elena. She hesitated for only a moment before opening the door. Max was sound asleep, nestled under his blankets, his body still as stone. Elena sighed in relief, but then her gaze fell to the floor. She froze. A set of small, dusty footprints led from the door to the center of the room, as if someone had walked through the dust while Max slept. She bent down to examine them closely. They were small, too small to be Max's, and they seemed to lead to the spot where his bed stood. But there was no way they could have been made without disturbing him. Max had been lying perfectly still. As she scanned the room, Elena couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that she was not alone. The scratching continued, now louder than ever. It came from the attic again, but this time, Elena couldn't deny it. The noise was no longer just a random sound. It was deliberate, like someone or something was trying to make itself known. She stepped back out into the hallway, her thoughts racing. She needed to know what was going on. The house had been empty for years, but why was she hearing things? Why was Max acting so withdrawn? And who had left those strange footprints? With a determined breath, she decided she would search the house again the next morning. But tonight, she would try to get some sleep. Little did she know, the real nightmare had just begun. The next morning, Elena woke early, her mind still heavy with the strange occurrences of the night. Max, as usual, was already awake and sitting at the small kitchen table, sipping his juice without a word. His expression was blank, but Elena was beginning to get used to it. He hadn't said more than a few words to her since they arrived, though she tried to engage him, offering him small talks about his likes, his dislikes, or how he was adjusting to his new home. But Max remained distant. Even when she asked him about the strange noises, he didn't respond. It was as if he didn't even acknowledge them. Elena forced herself to eat a light breakfast, trying to calm her nerves. After all, the day was full of things to do: unpacking, fixing small things around the house, and perhaps most importantly, getting to the bottom of the noise. Later that afternoon, Elena went into the attic again, this time prepared. She'd spent the morning reading about the house, searching old records at the local library, and talking to a few neighbors. But there were no answers. The house had a long history, but there was no mention of anything unusual, no deaths, no strange disappearances, nothing that could explain the eerie events she was experiencing. But as she climbed up into the attic again, this time with a camera in hand, she had a strange feeling that this time would be different. She started by taking pictures of the corners, the dusty furniture, the old trunks that had clearly been untouched for decades. She was almost ready to give up when something caught her eye: a piece of old paper sticking out from beneath one of the boxes. Elena knelt down and carefully pulled it out. It was a crumpled old letter, the edges worn and torn, as if it had been buried for years. The handwriting was messy and childish. She couldn't make out all of the words, but the message was clear enough. "Don't forget about me, Mommy." Her breath caught in her throat as she read the words over and over. It wasn't a message from Max. It couldn't have been. He didn't know anyone named Mommy. And yet, the handwriting was unmistakably childlike. For a moment, Elena stood frozen, holding the letter as if it were a clue to an unsolved mystery. But before she could make sense of it, she heard it again, the scratching. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the attic. It was coming from below, from Max's room. She bolted down the stairs, panic rising in her chest. What was happening? What was causing this noise? Why did she feel so exposed, so vulnerable? By the time Elena reached Max's room, her heart was racing. She pushed the door open, half expecting to find something unexplainable. But Max was still lying in bed, his eyes open now, though he didn't move when she entered. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. Max didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge her presence. Elena felt a chill crawl up her spine, but she stayed calm. She had to stay calm. "I found something today, Max," Elena said softly. "A letter. It said, 'Don't forget about me, Mommy.' Do you know anything about that?" Max blinked at her, and for a moment, Elena thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. But just as quickly, the moment passed. He didn't answer. He never answered. Her heart sank, but she refused to let this go. She couldn't. After all, there were more questions than answers. The next morning was overcast, the kind of gray day that weighed down the spirit. Elena could feel it in her bones. She had always been an optimistic person, a glass half full type of woman. But ever since she moved into this house, things had changed. The scratching in the attic, the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, the strange notes. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Something wasn't right. Max, as always, sat in the kitchen, pushing around a bowl of cereal. He hardly spoke, just stared at the walls, lost in his thoughts, a distant look in his eyes. Elena watched him as she sipped her coffee, her mind racing. The letter she'd found in the attic still haunted her. "Don't forget about me, Mommy." Who was the letter for? Why was it hidden away in the attic? And why did it feel as if the house itself was trying to speak to her, trying to warn her. She needed answers. She couldn't let this go. After a quick breakfast, Elena decided to take matters into her own hands. She wasn't the type to sit idly by when something felt wrong. She would find out who had lived in the house before her. She would uncover the truth about this child named Lily. She knew the local library might hold some answers, so after getting Max ready for his day at school, she made her way downtown. At the library, Elena spent hours scouring old newspapers, trying to find any mention of the house or its previous owners. She dug through microfiche and dusty records, her fingers stained with ink as she flipped through centuries-old documents. It was a tedious task, and for a moment, she felt foolish, wondering if perhaps she was just imagining the whole thing. But then, as the sun dipped low in the sky, she found it. A birth record, tucked in a corner of a folder that had been shoved to the back of a filing cabinet. The record listed the name of a child born in this very house. Lily Green, born in 1972. Her mother's name was Miriam Green, and according to the document, the mother had died shortly after giving birth. The father's name was listed as unknown. There was no mention of the child being adopted or sent to foster care, only a small note at the bottom of the page, dated a year later, that read, "Deceased under suspicious circumstances. Cause of death unexplained." Elena's breath caught in her throat. The child Lily had died here, in this house. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the note. Cause of death unexplained. It was a chilling sentence that left far too much to the imagination. Had Lily been murdered? Had she died because of something that had happened in the house? Had she been forgotten? Elena could feel the weight of the record in her hands. This was the beginning. Lily had been real, and something about this house, something about her death, was connected to the strange happenings that Elena had been experiencing. Later that evening, as Elena tucked Max into bed, the house felt colder than usual. She had done everything she could to help Max settle in. She had made his room comfortable, tried to make it feel like home, but lately, he had been withdrawing more and more. His silence was more than just the natural reticence of a shy child. It was as if he were detaching, as if he were no longer fully present in the world around him. Max lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. His eyes were wide, unblinking. "Max," Elena said softly, sitting on the edge of his bed. "Do you know who Lily is?" Max didn't respond, but his eyes flickered, just for a moment, to the corner of the room where shadows seemed to gather more than they should. His lips twitched, like he was trying to say something, but the words didn't come. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, before Max finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "She's not gone." Elena's heart raced. She didn't know if he meant Lily was still alive, or if he was simply referring to her presence in the house, but either way, it terrified her. Max had always been quiet, but this was something different. It was like he was aware of something she couldn't see, something she couldn't understand. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. The weight of the discovery about Lily's death weighed on her, and the strange scratching sound had returned, louder and more frantic than ever. It was no longer coming from the attic. It was coming from inside the walls. The sound scraped against the drywall, faint but unmistakable, as if something or someone was moving just beyond reach. Elena lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. She could feel the house shifting around her, the walls creaking as if something living was moving through them. She rolled over, trying to ignore the sense of dread that was crawling up her throat. She needed to check on Max. She needed to make sure he was okay. But when she opened his door, the room was empty. Elena froze in the doorway. Max's bed was unmade, the covers twisted as if he had been thrashing in his sleep. She stepped into the room, her heart pounding. There was no sign of him, no trace that he had even been there. "Max," she called softly. No answer. She moved down the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the old wooden floors. She checked the bathroom, the kitchen, the living room. No sign of Max anywhere. Her pulse quickened. He couldn't have just disappeared, could he? Panicking, Elena ran down the stairs to the basement door. Maybe he had gone down there, drawn to the old, musty space she hadn't fully explored yet. As her hand touched the doorknob, she felt a strange sensation, a pressure on her chest, as if someone were standing just behind her. She spun around. The hallway was empty, but then she heard it, a soft whisper coming from the farthest corner of the house. "Mommy." Max's voice. Elena rushed toward the sound, following the faint whisper through the darkened hallways. When she reached the source, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing at the far end of the hall, was Max, but he was different. His eyes were vacant, staring into nothing. His posture was stiff, like a doll whose strings had been pulled too tightly. "Elena," Max said, his voice low and hollow. "I never told you the whole story. Lily is still here. She's waiting for you. She doesn't want to be forgotten." Max's words hung in the air like a curse, and Elena felt a coldness take root in her bones. This wasn't her Max. This wasn't the boy she had adopted just a few weeks ago. There was something else inside him, something dark, something ancient. "Max, what are you talking about?" Elena whispered, stepping closer. She reached for him, but he backed away, shaking his head slowly. "You don't understand," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Lily was my sister, and she never left." A shudder ran through Elena. She had thought the haunting had something to do with the previous family. But this was far worse. She had read the records, and there had been no mention of a sister. Max had no sister. But now, Elena realized, there was so much more that she didn't know. Elena's head was spinning. The truth was beginning to surface, but the more she uncovered, the more terrifying the reality became. Lily had not only lived in this house, she had died here, but the story was far more sinister than a simple accident or illness. She had been murdered, but not in the way Elena had thought. The truth was more chilling than anything she could have imagined. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Elena realized the haunting in the house wasn't about Lily's death. It was about her vengeance. And now, Max was the key.